Hello, thanks for joining me today. Today I'm going to really speak to you from really a heavy heart because it seems like every day another story comes out about the cruel and inhuman tactics being employed in our current political administration's war on immigration. I hear stories about people being whisked away to a prison in El Salvador where they're subjected to really horrific treatment. They're being denied due process in the name of expediency and efficacy. I've even heard Todd Lyons, the director of ICE, said he wants the deportation process to operate like Amazon Prime, but with human beings. And they're promising a worse first approach to deportations. But the Trump administration, they've imposed these quotas on ICE that they're expected to have so many deportations daily that they're forced to focus on just quantity over quality. And you've been hearing stories about someone saying, oh, well, this is the wrong guy. And the senior ICE agent goes, well, let's take him anyway. So, in other words, to meet quotas, they can't thoughtfully target the most dangerous migrants, and they have to deport whoever they can get their hands on. And in some cases, they're even deporting people who are in this country legally. One very prominent case is the case of Albrego Garcia, and it's got a lot of attention. He was deported to El Salvador despite a court order that he not be sent back. And there are a lot of other cases that are just as disturbing. And when I look at the conditions the inmates at Secot Prison are forced to live in there in El Salvador, I can't support anyone being sent there, regardless of the crimes they may have committed. And beyond just that, I'm a teacher, and there have been threats of people coming in, ICE coming in and deporting students right from the classroom. And I have my students living in fear of being deported. They can't learn because they're worried about being deported, or they're worried about their close relatives being deported as well. And now, I want to start off by conceding that immigration enforcement is an issue that every presidential administration has to deal with, regardless of their political party. And there are some complex issues to discuss and debate related to the issue. And really, the solutions to all these problems are beyond the scope of my ministry here on this channel, and that's not what I want to talk about today. What concerns me is that the current immigration crackdown has this attitude that really mistreats those being deported. In an attempt to appear strong, the Trump administration is making a show of immigration enforcement, and they amplify the spectacle by being unnecessarily cruel in the process. You know, and there are a lot of discussions about how these measures violate the Constitution. Yes, they do. But an even greater concern to me is that they're just violate the moral teachings of the Bible, and yet there are so many Christians who are supporting it and cheering it on. Most of the people that I know recognize that this is wrong. The treatment that these undocumented migrants is just so obviously immoral. I don't feel like I should even need to open up the Bible to show you that it's wrong. But unfortunately, those people that I do know who support this immigration agenda, the overwhelming majority of them claim to be and profess to be Christians. None of my atheist or agnostic friends or acquaintances think this is okay. Jesus' golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's been embraced by every religion and moral philosophy in the world. I believe this is because God seared it into our conscience of all people, of all humanity, and it's something we instinctively recognize as a moral principle regardless of our religion or belief system. And I can't honestly say that I can't imagine anyone just trying to claim that, yeah, the way these immigrants are being treated is the way they would want to be treated. Nevertheless, there's all these evangelicals defending these efforts, and even, as I've said before, they're applauding them, they're cheering them on. So today, I want to look at some of the facts about immigration in America, what's going on, how the current administration is dealing with it, and I want to compare that with how the Bible teaches us to treat and interact with immigrants. Now, a driving force behind this anti immigration push is the idea that these measures are necessary to protect innocent U.S. citizens from violent criminals. This goes back to June 2015 when Trump rode down that escalator and launched his first presidential campaign. And from there, he starts addressing immigration. He said, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending the best. They're not sending you, they're sending people that have lost problems, and they're bringing those problems. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. And but I speak to the border guards, and they're telling us what we're getting. That was Trump's very words. So from the moment he entered in to the political fray, stopping this illegal immigration has been his key issue. Now, opposition to illegal immigration isn't a novel concept. Presidents of both parties have voiced opposition to people coming into our country without going through the proper channels. But up until Trump, the message was, we welcome immigrants, but there is a legal process to coming here that needs to be respected. Trump's attitude was, we have to stop them from coming because they're bad people. And that's the difference. And I've heard people try to say, oh, there's no difference between what Trump said and what Obama or Clinton or other presidents have said in the past that are on the other side of the political aisle. That's the difference. It's not because that's the law, but because in Trump's eyes and by Trump's assessment, these are bad people. Trump's own the White House's website, whitehouse.gov, says many of these aliens unlawfully within the United States present significant threats to national security and public safety, committing vile and heinous acts against innocent Americans. And so here they are. They're criminals. They're a threat to national safety, personal safety. And I've heard many people, most of whom call themselves Christians, compare illegal immigrants to burglars who are breaking into your house, and they say that the measures to defend the border are no different than locking your doors so that people don't come into your house at night and murder your family and steal all your stuff. And the influx of illegal immigration recent years has been repeatedly referred to by Trump and his followers as an invasion. The WhiteHouse.gov's page on Trump's immigration agenda is titled Protecting the American People Against Invasion. And I remember right after Russia invaded Ukraine a couple of years ago, and at the time I was still in a church that was very conservative, evangelical church, and that war had just started, and I remember offering a prayer request for the people of Ukraine, and one of the church members responded, well, what's going on at the southern border is no different than this Russian invasion. I wish I could tell you that I had a witty retort at the time, but I didn't, because at that moment I didn't think I could say much that wouldn't have been, if I've spoken, it would have been unchristlike, and I didn't want to start a brawl right there in church. But it was things, but no, the two things are nothing alike. In one case, you have an army with tanks and mortars coming in to occupy a sovereign nation. They've killed thousands of Ukrainian troops and civilians in the process. At the southern border, you have desperate people fleeing with their families to another country that they believe will offer them a better life. But they bypass some bureaucratic processes in their desperation to get away from the current situation. Russia's goal is to make Ukraine part of Russia. The immigrants' goal is to leave their native country so that they can become a part of the United States. So when that person says that there's no difference between the two, he was just parroting talking points he'd heard on Fox News without taking even 2 seconds to apply even an ounce of thought to what he was saying. But nevertheless, the Trump and right-wing media have successfully persuaded a large section of the American people that, and many of those that they persuaded are evangelicals, they persuaded them that illegal immigrants are this imminent threat to our safety. I've seen evangelicals posting memes on social media that warn of the dangers of immigrants by sharing a certain verse out of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 28:43 and following says, "The sojourner is among you shall rise higher and higher above you, and you shall come down lower and lower. He shall lend to you, and you shall not lend to him. He shall be the head, and you shall be the tail." Now, sojourner is a word that means resident alien, i.e. a foreigner. And this verse is just pasted out of context to imply that if you let all these foreigners into your country, they're going to take over. But as I said, implied earlier, the problem is that they've completely ignored the context of these verses. See, in Deuteronomy 28, it starts with a promise that if the nation of Israel keeps God's law that he's giving them here, they're going to be blessed. On the other hand, the chapter 28 of Deuteronomy offers a warning that there's going to be calamity that's going to fall upon them if they don't. And God promises Israel that they'll suffer all manner of disasters, including drought, pestilence, disease, as well as conquest and enslavement from invading armies. And the prediction of that conquest was eventually realized in the form of the Babylonian captivity that anyone who knows anything about the ancient Israel will be aware of. But see, when a large section of the Jewish inhabitants, though, were taken into slavery in Babylon, then the non-Jewish inhabitants of the land were in a position to increase in their own power and influence in the region. And that's what this verse is talking about. It has nothing to do with the prevalent conservative fear that unchecked immigration will lead to them being minorities and losing their power and privilege. In fact, one of the commandments in the previous chapter, which they were expected to keep and failing to keep, would lead to this judgment coming upon them, was that they wouldn't be unjust or treat foreigners unfairly. Therefore, if we assume that this promise applies to the U.S. and not just God's covenant nation, which is ancient Israel, and that's a big assumption, mistreating foreigners will result in God judging the nation and turning our land over to those foreigners that we despise. Again, according to that passage that so many conservatives are wanting to use. But I do share with conservatives a desire to keep my family and myself safe. And I think the desire for security could be a common ground for Americans across the political spectrum to share. And that we can come to agree on. So yes, we can agree. We all want to keep America safe. But let's look at whether illegal immigration really puts American citizens in danger, as the Trump administration wants to maintain. Now, conservatives and the Trump administration often point to Laken Riley, a 22-year-old nursing student who was brutally murdered by an illegal immigrant from Venezuela. I'll start by saying it's unequivocally true that what happened to her was absolutely horrific. And it's a heartbreaking situation. My heart goes out to her family. Her murderer was sentenced to life without parole, and I believe this was a just sentence, and I haven't heard any liberal advocates, personal or anywhere, advocate for this man's release or getting a lighter sentence. And if they did, I would oppose those measures. Yes, this guy was a bad man. He did something really horrible, and he should spend the rest of his life in prison for that. On the other hand, though, I fear that this tragedy has been used to advocate a political agenda, and in the process, this young woman's memory is being exploited. But regardless of whether keeping on mentioning her honors her memory or it exploits it, one has to ask yourself, why has so much emphasis been put on this one particular case? Considering the vast number of illegal immigrants in this country, if even a tenth of them were murderers, there would be hundreds of thousands of Laken Rileyans to talk about. Why then don't they cry out to say their names as Marjorie Taylor Greene called on Biden to say Laken Riley's name? The answer is quite simple. There aren't thousands or even hundreds of names to call out. The desperation for another name led them to try to put Aiden Clark into the national sphere. Now, Aiden Clark was an 11-year-old boy from Springfield, Ohio, who was killed by a Haitian immigrant. And the incident was mentioned by J.D. Vance amid the ridiculous "they're eating the dogs" hysteria that Trump stoked during the 2024 campaign. The problem is that Aiden Clark was killed in a traffic accident. The Haitian driver who hit him was sentenced for manslaughter. It wasn't ever clear that he was here as an illegal immigrant. He likely had legal status. And Aiden Clark's father pled for people to stop using his son to advocate a political agenda, saying that his death was a result of a tragic accident. But the need, so that leaves him focusing on Laken Riley, and the need to focus so much attention on Laken Riley should clue us all in on how rare cases like hers are. There are 11 million illegal immigrants in this country, and so inevitably some of them are going to be bad people. That's the real. But what is the actual reality of the crime rate of these invaders coming into our country? Now, the numbers I'm going to share with you are going to come straight from the U.S. Custom and Border Protection website. And this is straight from the government, people enforcing border and tracking down on illegal immigration. So they have no reason to shave off the numbers. But I took these numbers and applied some basic math to help me make sense of the data. And I'm going to post a link to, in the description of this video so you can find the website and check the numbers I share with you for yourself. So how many murders do you think undocumented immigrants commit in the United States every year? I'll say the number shocked me as someone who didn't approach the discussion expecting to discover that illegal immigrants are especially dangerous. But I was surprised to discover that my predictions were really way off. They're actually much lower than I would have expected to find from any group of people that large. From 2017 to 2024, the average number of homicide and manslaughter convictions of undocumented immigrants per year has been a whopping 24 a year. The highest number in any year in that period was 62, and there have been multiple years with only 2 or 3 murders or manslaughters perpetrated by illegal immigrants. In this 8-year period, there have only been 191 homicides or manslaughters committed by the estimated 11 million illegal immigrants in this country. 191, which is the number I would have expected to be an annual average. That is how many have been prosecuted in 8 years. This means that only one out of every 57,000 illegal immigrants killed someone in the last 8 years. On average, only 0.0002% of them will be convicted of murder in a given year. Remember, this includes homicides and manslaughter convictions, as well as manslaughter convictions. So even traffic accidents and other such incidents would be included in this number. Illegal immigrants, therefore, are responsible for 0.097% of the over 24,000 homicides that occur in the United States every year. In other words, practically none of these 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country are murderers. Likewise, a fraction of a percent of illegal immigrants are convicted in other crimes. They only represent 0.02% of assault and battery and domestic violence convictions in 2023. And only 0.04% of sexual assault convictions were committed in 2023 by undocumented immigrants. And I wasn't purposefully selecting that. I was looking at some other data to look at the actual murder rate, and 2023 was the most recent year, and I compared that with the Border and Immigration Enforcement website data. So I wasn't intentionally trying to find a year where it was particularly low. See, the Trump administration also wants to blame illegal immigrants on the drug trade, but undocumented immigrants only account for 0.08% of 0.08% of drug trafficking and possession convictions in the U.S. So you have 3% of the U.S. population being undocumented, but this 3% is responsible for only a fraction of a percent of the crime that's being committed. Therefore, they are far less likely to commit crimes than the U.S. population as a whole. Therefore, even if Trump did succeed in deporting every single illegal immigrant from the United States, there would not be a noticeable change in the crime rate in this country. These brutal deportation measures, they're not making us any safer. The fear of illegal immigrants is barely more rational than a child's fear of monsters under the bed. And that's the facts. Why then has this become such a major talking point? Well, I can't talk about motives, with any certainty, but I do know that a classic manipulation tactic is to make people fear a perceived danger and promise to be the only one who can protect you from that danger. And it's better for the manipulator if the danger isn't real, because it allows you to that manipulator to claim credit for the safety that their victims enjoy from these imagined dangers. Oh, you haven't been harmed yet. That's because I'm keeping you safe. Now, the manipulator in the scenario is the real danger, and I'm going to leave you to consider whether this might contribute to Trump administration's motives in stoking fear of immigrants. But regardless, painting undocumented immigrants as criminals isn't based on reality. There's no other way to put it. It's a lie. They are not criminals. Now, I suspect someone is screaming at their screen at this moment, but them coming here makes them criminals. And there's a common perception that the mere presence in this country as an illegal immigrant is a crime. This is a belief I used to share myself. I used to think that, they break the law with every breath they take in this country. And we do have to take the concern seriously. After all, if we don't respect our nation's laws, we can't maintain an orderly society. So what are the actual laws of U.S. immigration? First of all, it is not a crime to be in the U.S. without proper documentation. It's a civil offense, not a criminal one. Now, I've deliberately used the term illegal immigrant several times in this video, which many immigrant advocates believe is a misleading term, and I understand why. I've intentionally used it up to this point in the video to parrot the terminology that proponents of strong border enforcement use. But yes, I agree, it's a misleading term, because yes, being here illegal isn't, or being here undocumented isn't a crime in and of itself. It's just a civil matter, not a criminal matter. Secondly, asylum seekers aren't illegal. The current administration repeatedly labels asylum seekers as undocumented or illegal immigrants. Trump at times seems to even conflate those seeking asylum with those escaping or being released from insane asylums. He then compares them with the late, great Hannibal Lecter, something he mentioned multiple times on the campaign trail. This tactic paints the undocumented immigrant as dangerous, even though I just demonstrated that they pose no greater safety risk to the American people. There's not a danger to us from illegal immigrants as a whole. But more importantly, asylum seekers are here legitimately. Asylum is a legal process and is a part of both U.S. and international law. Anyone can request asylum to a country if they are feeling harm, persecution, or if they are fearing and fleeing harm, persecution, or for the persecution in their country of origin. Now, some people complain, well, they should come here the right way. And by this, they presumably mean they should apply for residency before arriving in this country. However, there's no process to pre-apply for asylum. You must be standing on U.S. soil to request asylum. And many asylum seekers arrive at legal points of entry and request asylum. In other words, they are doing it the right way. They are following processes outlined in our laws, but Trump compares them to invaders in following our legal processes. Now, once they get here, they will have a hearing to determine whether an immigration judge decides whether or not they're going to be granted asylum based on the actual merits of their case. And I will acknowledge that since legal ports of entry can get backed up, asylum seekers and they're fleeing really desperate situations. Some come across the country other than at these legal ports of entry and at the authorized checkpoints, and they just cross the border and then they request asylum once they encounter border patrol. This entire process is legal, except for the way some of them cross the border. Now, it is a crime to cross the border without being inspected and admitted by border officials. Now, this does apply to some asylum seekers, as I said. And when most people think of illegal immigrants, they think of people swimming across the Rio Grande River. Greg Abbott, the governor of my own state, has put out buoys wrapped in razor wire to stop people from swimming across. And Trump's famously advocated for building a wall across the entire U.S. border to stop all these people from swarming across our country. While some do cross the border this way, only about that only applies to about 45% of undocumented immigrants. Most either who are here undocumented have either overstayed their visas or they violated the terms of that visa. In both cases, they had a legal visa to get into the country to begin with. Say they violated the terms of their visa. That usually is something along the lines of they are here on a student visa and they drop out of school and stay here even after they finish school. But let's look at this crime of crossing the border illegally. This is a horrible thing that we have to take seriously, right? Well, it's only a misdemeanor offense. It's not a felony. And as a misdemeanor, the maximum sentence for first offense is a $50 to $250 fine and up to 6 months in prison. Also would point out that a person who crosses the border illegally can still legally request asylum, and how they got across the border doesn't affect their asylum claim according to law. So being an undocumented immigrant is hardly this heinous crime that some people try to make it out to be. Now, let's really think about how serious it should be if someone crosses into our border without proper authorization. Trump himself has repeatedly admitted that national borders are arbitrary lines drawn on a map. Of course, here he was talking about the northern border as part of his plea to lay claim to Canada as the 51st state. But I'd argue that the southern border is just as arbitrary. And if you doubt that, let's take a look at what the U.S. Southern border looked like prior to 1848. Give me one moment. Let me pull that up for you. Okay, so here we see that good portion of the southwestern United States, or the entire southwestern United States, used to be on the other side of the border. That includes Texas, most of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, portions of Oklahoma. All were once on the other side of the border. We moved the border. And so, yeah, when you talk about these things that can be moved and changed, so due to evasion, like in our case, we invaded Mexico, and the United States took half of their land, and yet, conservatives want to treat crossing that line without authorization as tantamount to breaking in to homes, so breaking and entering. But when you really look at the asylum process, they aren't so much like burglars breaking into your house as a woman knocking on the door, pleading for you to help her escape an abusive husband. I guess the Christian thing in that case would be to just turn her away and send her back to her husband, or maybe even drag her off to an even worse home where she'll be abused and wish she was back with her original abusive husband. Because that's the way current border enforcement policies seem to treat it. As I said before, the worst legal penalty you can face for any act directly related to illegal immigration is to serve 6 months for a misdemeanor. The Trump administration, however, wants to sentence these people to life without parole in an El Salvadorian torture prison. The administration has already sent 238 immigrants to CICOT Terrorism Confinement Center in El Salvador. They were forced to march into these prisons, forced to bend over while wearing shackles. They had their heads shaved. Prisoners of CICOT have to suffer systematic beatings and torture. They're locked into cells that are so overcrowded that each prisoner has only 6.45 square feet of space. And they spend 23 hours a day in those same cells. Their beds consist of metal slabs with no mattress, pillows, or blankets. The lights stay on 24 hours a day. They're denied access to basic needs like sufficient food, water, clothing, and health care. They aren't allowed to communicate with family members or their lawyers. Their families don't even know whether they're alive or dead most of the time. The government of El Salvador has made it clear that no one imprisoned at CICOT will ever get out of there alive. And Trump is not only sending people who came here illegally or without the proper documentation, he's not only sending them there to suffer for the rest of their lives. He told the dictator president of El Salvador that he'd need to build 5 more of those prisons to accommodate all the people he plans to send to that hellhole. Now I want to take a moment. I described it, but I want to just show you the inside of this place. That the Trump administration has determined to be the appropriate punishment for coming into this country without proper documentation. So let me pull that photo back up. So yeah, this is them being marched in. Here they are packed into their cells. Those are their beds. You notice they don't even, they're going to share those little tiny beds with multiple people. Crowded in. Just humiliated. What makes us think that this is okay? Now, the Trump administration insists that those that they send there are the worst of the worst. But U.S. officials admit that 137 of the 238 that the U.S. sent to CICOT prison have no criminal history. But they promise us that they still pose a serious threat. Some of those who did have some type of criminal history, had been accused of rape, murder, assault, and kidnapping, which is really bad. I don't want to minimize those crimes, but the majority of those with criminal records were for nonviolent offenses, and yet we're sending them there. And the real problem, though, is that whether they're good people or bad people, is they were denied the right to a trial. So they have been condemned to spend the rest of their lives in that hellhole, and they haven't been convicted of anything. Many of them were condemned to Sikhat because ICE officials arbitrarily interpreted the meaning of their tattoos or clothing to be associated with gang affiliation. Earlier in the introduction of this video, I mentioned Abrego Garcia. He's the most high-profile person the U.S. has shipped to Sikhat in El Salvador. Abrego Garcia has never been convicted of any criminal offense. The Trump administration claims that his tattoos and a Chicago Bulls garb indicates that he must be a member of the gang MS-13. He was sent to Sikhat despite a court order declaring that he should be protected from being returned to El Salvador. And the Trump administration officials admitted in court that he was sent there due to an administrative error. The Supreme Court has determined that Garcia's removal was illegal and has ordered that the administration facilitate and effectuate his return. But as of this filming, Garcia is still imprisoned in El Salvador. Beyond Abrego Garcia, let's look at André Hernandez Romero, a makeup artist from Venezuela. He has no criminal record. He's active in his hometown theater troupe. By all accounts, just a peaceful man. He was awaiting his asylum hearing, and he had a strong case to be granted asylum. The government had acknowledged he faced credible threats in his home country of Venezuela. On the day of his hearing, he missed it, and he seemed to have disappeared without a trace. His lawyer didn't know what had happened to him until he saw him in the photo of prisoners being escorted into Sikhat prison, or Sikhat. He had been identified by his tattoos because the administration has yet to release the names of the Venezuelans sent to Sikhat. Remember, asylum is a legal process, and André Hernandez Romero was following this legal process until the legal process was interrupted by ICE officials arbitrarily labeling him as a threat and condemning him to spend the rest of his life in a hellhole there in El Salvador. This horrific treatment is blatantly wrong, and it's blatantly unbiblical. The Bible includes the sojourners, the resident aliens, the foreigners, as among the oppressed classes who God wants us to treat well, along with widows and orphans. Therefore, God demands that they be offered justice. Exodus 22:21 and following. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. Exodus 23:9. You shall not oppress the sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy 24:17 and 18. You shall not pervert the justice due the sojourner, or to the fatherless, or take the widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. Deuteronomy 27:19. Cursed be anyone who perverts the justice due the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. And all the people shall say, Amen. Before you try to claim that their treatment is just because they are being punished for their crimes, let me remind you that in the United States, no one is a criminal without due process. Now, you don't even have to be a Constitution scholar to know this. You only have had to watch a police drama on TV. We all know that the law guarantees that we are all presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. You know this. It's a guarantee of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentment of indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of liberty life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken from the public use without just compensation. That is the Fifth Amendment in whole. Notice the text doesn't say no citizen should be denied due process. It says no person. So immigration status is irrelevant. The Trump administration policy is denying asylum seekers and undocumented immigrants their right to due process, a right guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. But due process isn't the only constitutional right that the Trump administration is wanting to interfere with. The First Amendment is our right to free speech, and exercising that right is getting legal immigrants deported. These are immigrants who did it the right way by getting student visas, but then they've had those visas revoked, requiring them to leave the country and stopping them from completing the degree programs that they've already invested a significant amount of time and money into. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, admits that at least 300 students' visas have been revoked. But American Immigration Lawyers Association claims that the real number is in the thousands. In some cases, the students have reportedly even been imprisoned. Now, some of these visas were revoked, student visas were revoked because of minor offenses like speeding tickets. But the majority of them were because the students participated in protests. Now, whether you agree with what they were protesting or not is irrelevant. Because if we only have the right to express views the government approves of, there is no freedom of speech in this country. The real measure of freedom of speech is whether or not you have a right to say things that the government doesn't like. But some claims that the rules should be different for undocumented immigrants. I've heard people claim, well, you don't deserve due process when you're here illegally. I've already addressed the issue of being here illegally and shown that explicit declaration that the Constitution explicitly declares that you're guaranteed due process regardless of your immigration status. But let's look beyond that at the very basis of the U.S.'s concept of rights, and that's expressed in the Declaration of Independence, where it says these famous lines: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Excuse me. The American ideal isn't that our rights are privileges granted by some government. They are God-given rights common to all people, but tyrannical nations fail to recognize them. The colonies declared their independence to establish the sovereign nation that would recognize and protect rights that belong to all people as a divine gift. While the U.S. has repeatedly fallen short of this ideal throughout its history, it is our foundational principle. And to restrict the constitutional rights to U.S. citizens is the betrayal of what makes America the land of the free to begin with. And while I've always enjoyed the privileges that come with being an American, ultimately my primary concern isn't preserving American ideals. I'm committed to proclaiming the principles of the Word of God and striving to live them out in my own life. And the Bible demands that we should have the same rule for the foreigner as for the native. Leviticus 24:22, "You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God." Numbers 15:16, "One law and one rule shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you." Numbers 15:29, You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is native among the people of Israel, and for the stranger who sojourns among them. Exodus 12:49, "There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among them." If you want to separate the rules of law for the foreigner and the native citizen, then you don't have a biblical idea of justice. Because the Bible makes it clear that the same law should be for the sojourner, the foreigner, as it is for the citizen. And as we're talking about a biblical idea for justice, we can't forget mercy. James 2:13 says, "For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment." And considering that undocumented immigrants statistically pose no discernible threat, and the laws they violated either if civil infractions or misdemeanors, can't we show some mercy to them? What about specific groups? What about the DACA recipients? By DACA, I'm referring to people who came to this country as children and have been given a measure of protection by previous administrations, protections that the Trump administration no longer wants to honor. But if they came here as children, why can't they be shown some mercy? These are people who didn't decide to come to this country without authorization. Their parents brought them here when they would have been completely ignorant of the procedures that would have made their presence in this country valid to begin with. They've lived their entire lives here, have become contributing members of society, and this country would have been the only home they've ever known. I mean, would you kick them out just because their parents didn't do it the right way when they brought them here? I mean, let's think about that. If a parent takes their child along with them on an armed robbery, do you prosecute the child as an accomplice? Let's just look at like Jimena Arias. She's a 19-year-old woman from Georgia. She's lived in the United States since she was 4 years old. She was pulled over for a traffic stop and didn't have a proper license. ICE has detained her for over 100 days, and she's facing deportation back to her country, a country she doesn't know. Now, if you want to talk about her being facing the penalty for the traffic violations, then that's fine. But are these traffic violations really reason to expel her from her home? And in cases such as this and others where you have these DACA, isn't mercifully offering a path to legal residency more just than deporting them? The Justice Department insists, however, that in this matter, we are not ignoring the rule of law, period. The rule of law is there. What about citizens' right to U.S. citizens' right to stay in this country, though? You know, we wouldn't deny that. If you're a U.S. citizen, you can't be deported. Just a few weeks ago, 3 children were forced to go to Honduras. All 3 of them were born in the United States. And while Trump wants to contest birthright citizenship, the Constitution explicitly expresses that if you're born in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. Birthright citizenship is constitutional. And again, you don't have to be a lawyer to understand that. You just have to be able to read at a 3rd grade level. Their mother, however, while they were citizens, their mother was an undocumented immigrant. And the Justice Department deported her just a couple weeks ago. And when they deported her, they made her choose whether or not to take her 3 small children with her or leave them orphaned here in this country. Understandably, she brought them with her. Now, to make matters worse, one of her children, her 4-year-old son, is battling stage 4 cancer. And they weren't even allowed to return to their home to receive his medicine before being sent out of the country. I want to reiterate that one of these U.S. citizens is a 4-year-old with stage 4 cancer, and the country he's being removed to doesn't have an adequate healthcare system. Conservatives always talk about, well, we got to protect the children, ban books, stop drag queens. All these things it's always about protecting the children. But I don't see them showing any concern for the welfare of this horribly sick boy. In this case, wouldn't it be more just to grant legal residency to this mother so she could be here to care for her U.S. citizen children, especially considering the health concerns of one of those children? Why would we prioritize persecuting this minor immigration offense over caring for U.S. citizen children, especially when they're terminally ill? But no, This mother had to go, and in the process, they effectively deported her 3 U.S. citizens along with her. Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, said of the incident, "Having a U.S. citizen child does not make you immune from our laws." The Trump administration and its followers act as if it's a simple matter. A person broke the law, they must face the consequences in full. There's no room for mercy in their view of justice. Now, the justice system shows mercy and leniency to people all the time. They don't want to acknowledge that. But if you're a conservative, don't pretend you don't know how to overlook even the slightest infraction of the law, because you overlooked 34 felonies when you cast your vote for Donald Trump back in November. Let's be real. Finding a job after serving a felony sentence is a really rough thing to do. But if you've been convicted of 34 felonies and are still awaiting sentencing, while also having 3 criminal trials pending in which you've already been indicted for another 56 felony charges, you're unhireable anywhere. You cannot get a job at McDonald's under those circumstances. No one's going to even think about hiring you. Nevertheless, Trump escaped penalty for his crimes by getting hired to the most prestigious job in the world, President of the United States, because he had enough supporters willing to overlook all of his crimes and still vote for him. Nevertheless, there is no willingness to show an ounce of mercy to the undocumented immigrants who've committed this horrific crime of not jumping through all the right hoops and pursuing their shot at the American dream. Not only do they refuse to show mercy, the Trump administration has challenged the constitutional rights of due process, free speech, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, and birthright citizenship, while defying court orders, even from the Supreme Court, so that they can make a show of cruelty towards these undocumented immigrants. Trump's disregard for the Constitution should be a far greater concern to Americans than the civil and misdemeanor crimes of and infractions of undocumented immigrants. But this immigration agenda isn't about justice. That's clear. There's no justice being seen here. This is not focusing on justice. It's about hate. Stoking hatred of another group to create a common enemy is another common manipulation tactic. And the political right of America has manipulated its followers into hating this group of people. And let's be real, for many on the right, the crime that they are most concerned about isn't whether they cross the border illegally, is that these people had the audacity to be born with skin that's darker than their own. You know, racism is a factor that at this, and it's undeniable. And if you want to try to take the racism factor out of this, you're kidding yourself. What attitude should we have towards the foreigner and the undocumented immigrant in our midst? What would the Bible have us do? Well, let's look at Leviticus 19:33 and following. It says, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You shall not do wrong in judgment, in measure of length, or weight, or quantity. You shall have just balances, just weights, just ephah, and just hin. And I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." And this is a little bit more, this passage goes in a little bit more detail, but I would encourage you to compare this with Deuteronomy 10:18-19 to know that it's not a one-off. And I want to draw attention to a couple things from this passage. First of all, he reminded his listeners that they were themselves strangers in the land of Egypt. And this was repeatedly echoed in the verses I read earlier about depriving the sojourner of justice. God, repeatedly reminds them when dealing with the stranger, the sojourner, that they were themselves sojourners in Egypt. So God's saying, when you deal with foreigners, remember, you used to be a foreigner yourself. He does this because he's trying to move them to have empathy for the foreigners. I know some evangelicals are trying to twist empathy into some kind of sin because their corrupted and hateful perversion of Christianity can't survive in an empathetic heart. I addressed this so-called sin of empathy in a previous video, so I'm not going to go dwell on it here, but I'll say that God wants us to be empathetic towards the immigrants coming into our country. Learn their stories and put yourself in their shoes. How would you want to be treated in their circumstances? Furthermore, this passage insists we must never harm a foreigner. And then he also says we should treat them the same as we would treat our fellow citizens. Now, I live in an area with a large Hispanic population. I don't know whether the people I interact with on a daily basis, whether they're documented or not. And honestly, I don't really care. I don't even care whether where they're from. I don't care if they're born here, whether they've come here from another country. I embrace them as my fellow human beings because that's how God would have us treat them. This passage also then insists that we shouldn't cheat them in matters of commerce. That's a whole deal with all the weights and measures things. Cheating them also includes wages, and could be a video in and of itself. But there's a long-standing complaint that I've heard that these people coming in and they're taking all the jobs. No. Many of them come here and work as practical slaves for criminally low wages, picking produce so that we can have lower grocery prices. I don't like paying high prices for groceries any more than you do, but I would pay a few cents more on each item so that those who pick that produce could get an honest wage for the work that they're doing, because it's right. The last thing I want to point out from this passage is that we're to love the foreigner like we love ourselves. Earlier in this same chapter, we find the command, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus paired this command with the command to love God with all your heart, soul, and might as his greatest commandments and the foundation of all Scripture. When God gave Moses that command to love our neighbor as ourselves, a few verses later, he reiterates the statement by commanding us to love the sojourner as ourselves, so that we couldn't argue that the sojourner doesn't count as our neighbor. Oh yeah, we love our neighbors as ourselves, but they're not our neighbor. They're a foreigner. They're here illegally. No, the Bible doesn't leave that open to us. And maybe it's part of our fallen human nature to look for loopholes in this fundamental command to love our neighbor. When Jesus gave the command and identified it as one of the great commands, someone asked, well, who's our neighbor? And Luke 10:25 and following gives us the answer. We know it as the parable of the Good Samaritan. It tells us about a man who was robbed and left for dead. Two upstanding members of his own country passed him by, but a Samaritan, a foreigner, perhaps the most despised of all foreigners of his day, stops and helps him. Jesus then asks, who then was this man's neighbor? And they say, oh, well, the man who helped him, thinking that, oh yes, if he's just saying you have to love those who help you. But Jesus says, okay, if the Samaritan was his neighbor, then you should act like the Samaritan. Jesus used this foreigner as an illustration of the type of love he expects us to have towards all people. So he expects us to love the foreigner as well. We can't get away from our responsibility to love the immigrants in our country, whether they're documented or not, and still be right with God. Jesus even commands us to love our enemies, which I know is very hard. Undocumented immigrants shouldn't be viewed as our enemies, but the current president has done all he could to get people to view them that way. But even if you buy into this misguided notion that by coming here to try to look for a better life, they are our enemies, invaders, that doesn't excuse you from the responsibility to love them. Now, I've seen multiple cases where journalists go to Trump rallies and interview the attendees. And a question I've heard them ask several times is, what would you do if Jesus was waiting at the border trying to get into this country? And the response I've heard every time is that something along the lines is, they'd welcome them as long as he came in legally. Now, mind you, these are people who all claimed to be Christians. And that was asked by the interviewer before they asked that question. So you have Christians saying that they would turn Jesus over to ICE if he didn't come into this country the right way. Now, the interviewer's question was motivated by Matthew 25:31 and following, in which Jesus likens himself to the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the prisoner, saying, he will consider your treatment of these people as treatment of himself. As you did it unto the least of my brothers, you did it unto me. Now, it's significant that among this list of people, Jesus lists the stranger. Stranger is the translation of the Greek word genos, which means someone not of one's family or nation, or just a foreigner. So for the purposes of discussion, I want to read this passage, but I'm going to leave out what Jesus says about the hungry, thirsty, sick, etc., and focus solely on what Jesus says about the stranger, so that the stranger doesn't get lost in the crowd of other people Jesus would have us minister to. I'm going to also translate genos, a foreigner, to further help us to realize what Jesus says in this passage and how it applies to our treatment of the foreigner. So here I go, Matthew 25:31 and following, with these slight modifications, which are leaving out certain things. Foreigner is a perfectly legitimate translation of genos. So here we go. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on his right, come you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was a foreigner, and you welcomed me. Then the righteous will answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you a foreigner and welcome you? And the king will answer him, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of my brothers, you did it unto me. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was a foreigner, and you did not welcome me. Then they will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you a foreigner and did not minister to you? And he will answer them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Jesus doesn't beat around the bush here. When you turn away those people at the border, you are turning away Jesus. When you deport DACA recipients because their parents didn't follow all the right rules when they brought them to this country, you are deporting Jesus. When we assume that an immigrant's tattoo indicates a gang affiliation and we send him to a torture prison in El Salvador without trial, we're sending Jesus away to be beaten and tortured. In other words, churches that celebrate Trump's heartless deportation measures are deporting Jesus from their midst. And when they stand before him someday, they'll face the real threat of being deported from his kingdom into the outer darkness. And if you're okay with that, and you decide that you're going to maintain your undying loyalty to Trump and his heartless immigration efforts, then stop pretending to be a Christian. Yes, I just said that. Don't soil the reputation of my Lord and Savior by advocating these wicked policies in his name. Jesus said that a person can't serve two masters, and you cannot serve God and Trump. You might have voted for him because you thought he was the better of the two choices. I'm not talking about that. But the campaign is over. Biden and Harris they're out of the picture, and Trump is the one in office, and he's executing a godless agenda with the authority that you gave him with your vote. The true people of God will judge the president's actions, regardless of their party, according to the Bible. And it doesn't matter whether you voted for him or not. You have to hold them to the right standards of morality and say, this is right or this is wrong. There's no room for a Christ follower to have a blind devotion to that so many evangelicals have shown towards Trump. They wholeheartedly support his policies, even when they contradict everything that Jesus stands for. And they celebrate the harsh cruelty of this immigration policy. 1 John 4:20 and 21 says, "If anyone says, 'I love God,' and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother." If you view your neighbor as an immigration status rather than a human being, then you don't love him. If you're okay ripping your neighbor away from his home, his spouse, his children, and everything they've ever known because of decisions their parents made when they were children, then you do not love them. If your neighbor comes here seeking refuge from persecution in another country and you send them back to their persecutors, then you do not love them. If you want to lock your neighbor in that hellhole in El Salvador, regardless of what they've done, you do not love them. In short, if you support the anti-immigrant measures of Trump, the love of God is not in you. But for reasons I can't understand, evangelicals love Donald Trump. He's the least Christ-like person to ever live in the White House. Robert Jeffers, who's pastor of First Baptist Church, Dallas, which is right here close to where I live in my area. He was one of the first evangelical leaders to throw his lot in with Trump. And he's been faithfully leading others to line up behind Trump and his agenda ever since. Now, Jeffers argues that despite the many obvious moral failings of Trump, Christians should overlook that and support Trump because his policies align with Christian values. Well, Trump's number one policy has always been immigration, and his policy regarding immigration is utterly evil. Trump's immigration policy is opposed to the values of the Bible. Trump's immigration policy is opposed to the U.S. Constitution. Trump's immigration policy is opposed to the most basic standards of human decency. Anyone with a working moral compass should be able to see that this is evil. Still, a lot of Christians stand with Trump and applaud the wickedness of his immigration policy. But I'm not that kind of Christian.